I'm very pleased to introduce the head of the Heights Upper School, Mr. Michael Moynihan. Michael, welcome to the webinar. It's good to see you.
Thank you, Rich.
So we will begin with a question that we got in advance. The question is, what is a classical education?
Very good. So a classical education, it doesn't mean exactly the same thing to everyone who uses the term, but I think I think it's fair to say that in general, we could come up with a reasonable understanding of what's meant by the term today, and perhaps work towards a description or a definition of what that term means. So I would say that a classical education is not narrowly understood as simply going back to the ancient classical period and only looking at that period of time and doing education that way. It's not that we are going to show up people are going to show up to a classical academy today wearing togas and trying just to learn about ancient Greece and the way that education was done in ancient Greece. That's would be a very unfair caricature. Rather, classical education is generally understood as what happened in the Western world, the Western tradition, and even in other parts of the world as well, prior to fairly recent times in education. So what happened in ancient Rome, what happened in medieval Europe, what happened in more early modern Europe, what happened in the United States all the way up till 1850 or even beyond. These would be what you would witness in educational institutions and witness about education in general at those times would be what many people consider to be a classical education. In a classical education, the liberal arts are important. Grammar, logic, rhetoric, the quadrivium as well, and a training of the mind is very important. So it's not so much about how can we help people to acquire the skills which will make them productive in modern society. That's not the primary focus of a classical education. The primary focus of a classical education is how can we help somebody to become the best version of themselves that they possibly can be through having an education which trains their mind to truly be excellent, and at the same time helps them to enter into a great dialogue that's been going on for centuries, all the way back since the ancient times till the present, on what it means to be human, what the world is really like, what is reality, what is truth, what are we meant to do, how are we meant to live together in community. These great questions are all important, and classical educators will say that we need to enter this conversation ourselves. They oftentimes will say that if we just look at education as having a narrow social function, maybe it's to prepare for certain careers, or it's to help us to live in a certain way in the modern world, or even to try to make the modern world better in some ways, according to the way some people would want to define that we're really missing out, that the answers to the complex problems that we're facing in our world today require us going back and delving into the wisdom of our past, and not just assuming that things can be figured out from an overly technical solution, that the best answers to these questions didn't emerge with the progressive era, and you need to go kind of behind that era as well to find answers in the classical tradition. So I think that description of a classical education would be one that most people who would use that word would be able to get on board with.
Great. If we are not a classical school, then how would we describe ourselves?
Well, first of all, I would like to say that we're, in many ways, we embrace the same understanding and values that many people who would use the word classical would use. At the Heights, we are very interested in going back to the tradition. We are very interested in pursuing this great conversation that's been going on for centuries, helping our students to enter it. We do a lot of things which would be similar to what would be common in a classical academy, teaching logic, teaching the liberal arts very well. But at the same time, we also want to come up with what's best in more contemporary times, and we want to understand what some of the good aspects of the changes that have taken place in education throughout the 20th century and even until recent times are. How, in what ways was the classical world and this classical understanding of human nature limited, and in what ways is it very important and fundamental and not going to change? So at the Heights, I think it'd be fair to say that we are very much in many ways classical, but we're also contemporary. We're also very interested in things on the cutting edge, if you will, and that's an important part of our ethos. We want to pursue the good, the true, and the beautiful, not just as it's found prior to 1900, but how it's been pursued by people even of our own times as well.
I graduated from the Heights before we had Zoom, so I'm still mastering the mute button. Sorry. But
the new,
exactly.
Yeah.
The new. So wonderful. We have that's a lot to talk about and think about there. A question: do you have any feedback from past alumni on how this approach helped them in their future studies or work?
So sure. I mean, Heights alumni are in many different lines of work, and I think that many of them will say that as with other classical academies, our focus on the tradition and our focus on a training of the mind, which we would share in common with classical academies, has served them very well. They go to college and they find that they are exceptionally well prepared for college. They can write, they can argue, they can defend their positions exceptionally well. And many of the Heights graduates mention that they're helping their colleagues and realizing in a way just how lucky they were to have a Heights education. Our openness to new things has led to us having alumni in many cutting edge fields, technology, medicine, computer programming, data analysis. These are all good things, and we have several alumni who are working in these fields, trying to bring, if you will, this human dimension and this sense of wisdom and sense of perspective to bear on their professional work in these areas. And they'll mention that they're exceptionally well prepared for this. See, the bottom line is when you pursue the liberal arts very well, you are, in a sense, pursuing human excellence. And this can translate into the modern world and the modern world of work that is around us, and help people to be able to be in a better position to make the right technical contributions as well as the right human contributions to this world that we live in.
That's really helpful. How, and maybe just to put a finer point on the question, you talk about, our alums, obviously there are great places like, they're at places like Google and Apple and Tesla and all the rest of it. We have alumni working in these places. How, to kind of maybe flip the question, in what way might a graduate of a school like ours that is open to the more modern, to the creative, how might that student, the product of our liberal arts education, be better prepared than one from a school that embraces so very much of the classical tradition, but not necessarily the fullness of what we're trying to present here? Does that make sense? It's kind of a different way of coming.
It does make sense. You're trying to put a real fine point on the question, Rich. I appreciate it. And just let me first of all say that I think the most important thing is to be very well grounded in the tradition, and to not look at everything that's gone before us as primitive and not having meaning for the world that we live in today. And in addition to that, the pursuit of a classical approach to education can really result in tremendous professional possibilities, because what you're really focusing on is the development of the human person in a great deal of intellectual virtue. Okay, but having said that, we also want students to graduate from the Heights who are very wise to the ways of the world today, that they understand the contemporary situation that we're living in, that they understand something about modernity. And what about modernity is good? And when I use the word modernity, I'm referring to the period that has emerged since the 1400s to fairly recently into the 20th century. And it's been a period that has been waning since then. And what about the contemporary concerns about people today in this context that we live in right now, where modernity is very much in crisis? What concerns do they have that are valid as well? And how can we help these concerns that are being brought to the fore now to even shed extra perspective and light on what we know from going all the way back to the ancients and all the way up through the Middle Ages, through times that are often neglected by people who have a more progressive approach to education. So we at the Heights would want students to understand that, you know, if you are in the modern business world, this is the way that things work. You know, this is the type of analysis that contemporary executives are going to use when they are studying real life business problems. And in that, it is not just important to know classical math. It's not just important, for example, to know Euclidean geometry. We do teach Euclidean geometry here at the Heights. We go back to Euclid's Elements and actually use that as a text. It's not just important to know algebra and calculus and all the type of data analysis that would be based on those subjects, but it's important to even know statistics and things along those lines and attempting to integrate things in that way. And you should understand the contemporary world. You should understand how finance works. We have a bunch of our seniors this year have a class in Introduction to Investing that in many ways is a class on how does the modern world work? You know, where would you go? Why is New York City and London? Why are these such important hubs? And what do people who want to start their own business, what do they do? And I think this type of spirit of entrepreneurship and openness to coming up with creative solutions to contemporary problems has led many of our alumni to go out and start their own companies and to get involved in entrepreneurship as well. So we want very much to bring the conversation all the way up to the present and not just enter the great conversation that's been taking place prior to the more progressive turn that things have taken 20th century on.
It strikes me that what we're really pursuing, well, I mean, not like everything encapsulated in this one idea, but one aspect of what we're hunting for here is to give our students the virtue of prudence, which requires both an awareness of these timeless principles, but also the concrete realities that you're making decisions in here and now. And rather than focusing just on the here and now without regard to the principles of goodness, truth, and beauty, but also without just focusing on goodness, truth, and beauty without focusing on what's going on right now. We're trying to do a little bit of both. And I think that puts our guys in a pretty good place. So
yes, I would agree. Prudence is a very key virtue, the hinge virtue.
The hinge, love it. Any other questions, friends? Thank you for the ones you've sent our way. This has been a fun conversation, but unless I see any other little red circles jump up at me, I'm sure Mr. Moynihan and I will go off to lunch to continue this conversation over a meal.
Very good.
That's it. Michael, thank you very much for the podcast, for the article, and for this. Really good to talk to you.
Sure. Thanks, Rich.